The dawn of June 22, 1941, forever changed the course of history. At 4 in the morning, as most Soviet border guards dozed at their posts and silence reigned in military towns, the sky over the western border of the USSR was lit up by flashes of artillery salvos. Thousands of German guns opened fire, announcing the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in the history of mankind. On the southwestern front, where some of the most powerful mechanized formations of the Red Army were located, the first hours of the war turned into chaos and confusion. Tank armadas of Colonel General Kleist, supported by Luftwaffe aviation, rapidly broke through Soviet defenses. The front commander, Colonel General Kirponos, found himself in an extremely difficult situation. Communication with units was disrupted. Intelligence data arrived in fragments, and orders from Moscow contradicted each other. It was here, on Ukrainian soil, in the triangle of the cities Dubno-Lutsk-Rovno, that the largest tank battle of the initial period of the war would unfold in the coming days. A battle that would become the first harsh lesson for Soviet tankers. At the outbreak of the war, the Southwestern Front possessed impressive armored power. 5 mechanized corps, the 4th, 8th, 9th, 15th, and 22nd, theoretically boasted around 3,000 tanks of various types. This was a colossal force, capable, in the opinion of the Soviet command, of crushing any enemy in case of war. The 8th Mechanized Corps, under General Ryabyshev, stood out particularly. It comprised over 800 tanks, including the newest KV-1 and T-34s. These machines surpassed any German tanks of that period in their combat characteristics. The armor of the KV-1 was practically invulnerable to standard Wehrmacht anti-tank guns, while the T-34 combined excellent protection, mobility, and firepower. However, reality differed significantly from theoretical calculations. Most mechanized corps were in the process of formation. A significant portion of the tank fleet consisted of obsolete machines, light T-26s, BT-5s, and BT-7s. Many of them required repairs or had depleted their engine life. The newest tanks, comprising less than 10% of the total, often lacked spare parts, and their crews had not fully mastered the combat vehicles. A serious problem was the level of personnel training. The mass repressions of the late 1930s decapitated the tank forces, depriving them of experienced commanders. Most officers had limited experience managing large tank formations. Rank-and-file tank crews often received only basic training. Many driver mechanics had only a few hours of practical driving. The issue of material and technical support was no less acute. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts reserves were mainly stored in stationary depots, often far from unit deployment locations. Repair bases were few and unprepared to service equipment in field conditions. Communication between units left much to be desired. Many tanks lacked radios, which critically limited command capabilities in battle. The Corps Command had no clear understanding of the tactics for using large tank formations. Pre-war exercises were rare and did not simulate real combat conditions. Interaction with infantry, artillery, and aviation was insufficiently practiced. The experience of battles in Spain and at Khalkhin Gol was poorly considered, and the lessons of the Soviet-Finnish War were completely ignored. Colonel General Ewald von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group was a perfectly calibrated war machine. By June 1941, it was one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced armored formations, having passed through the crucible of the Polish and French campaigns. Unlike Soviet mechanized corps, German panzer divisions had behind them not only theoretical training, but also invaluable combat experience of the Blitzkrieg. Kleist's group included 3 panzer divisions, the 11th, 13th, and 16th, as well as the SS motorized division Viking, and a number of other motorized formations. In terms of the number of tanks, the group was significantly inferior to Soviet mechanized corps. only about 600 vehicles in total. However, the German command compensated for this with the quality of organization and interbranch cooperation. The core of Kleist's tank fleet consisted of medium tanks PZ-3 and PZ-4. Although they were inferior in armor protection and firepower to the newest Soviet KV and T-34 tanks, the Germans had other advantages. Each German tank was equipped with a radio station, which ensured continuous control in battle. Crews operated cohesively, and tank commanders had an excellent view of the battlefield thanks to special commanders' cupolas. German tank tactics differed fundamentally from Soviet ones. Instead of massive frontal assaults, the Germans used the principle of the tank wedge. The spearhead of the wedge was formed by tank divisions, which rapidly broke through enemy defenses and penetrated deep into its territory. They were followed by motorized units, which expanded the breakthrough and secured the flanks. Infantry divisions closed the formation, encircling and destroying scattered enemy groups. The most important element of the German blitzkrieg was the close cooperation of tanks with aviation. Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers acted as flying artillery, suppressing resistance points before tank attacks. Messerschmitt fighters ensured air superiority, preventing Soviet aviation from effectively supporting its ground forces. The logistical support of Kleist's tank group was impeccably organized. Mobile repair workshops followed directly behind combat units, allowing for quick restoration of damaged equipment. Fuel and ammunition supplies were delivered along pre-planned routes. German tankers never experienced such a shortage of fuel and shells as Soviet mechanized corps encountered in the first days of the war. The command staff of Kleist's group was distinguished by its high professionalism. Many officers had been trained in the Reichswehr during the Weimar Republic, where the principles of tank warfare were secretly practiced. They had a clear understanding of their tasks and powers within the framework of the Auftragstaktik concept. Mission-type tactics, where commanders on the ground could show initiative to achieve set goals. On June 22, 1941, at 4 o'clock in the morning, German troops crossed the border of the Soviet Union along its entire length. On the sector of the southwestern front, the 1st Panzer Group of Kleist delivered the blow, supported by powerful forces of infantry and aviation. The German offensive began with a massive artillery barrage. Thousands of shells rained down on Soviet border outposts, command posts, and communication centers. Border guards bore the brunt of the enemy's first strike. They fought heroically, but the forces were unequal. Within a few hours, German tank wedges had broken through the border defenses and surged deep into Soviet territory. The Wehrmacht's 3rd Motorized Corps, advancing in the direction of Lutsk, was particularly successful. By the end of the first day of the war, its vanguard units had advanced 20 to 30 kilometers. The Soviet command found itself in an extremely difficult situation. Communication with units was disrupted. Many command posts were destroyed by enemy aircraft. The commander of the Southwestern Front, Colonel General Kirpanos, tried to gather information about what was happening, but the reports were fragmented and often contradictory. In the first hours of the war, the actions of Soviet troops were paralyzed by the directive of Defense Commissar Timoshenko, which forbade opening return fire without special orders. By the time permission was received, precious time had already been lost. Many airfields were bombed, and a significant portion of Soviet aviation was destroyed on the ground. The mechanized corps of the Southwestern Front, which could have been a powerful means of counterattack, were dispersed over a large area. General Ryabishev's 8th Mechanized Corps was located 150 kilometers from the border, the 9th and 15th even further. Their advance to the front line required time and organization. German tank divisions operated according to the well-rehearsed Blitzkrieg scheme. Breaking through defenses in narrow sectors, they did not engage in protracted battles with pockets of resistance, but rapidly pressed forward, creating a threat of encirclement for large groupings of Soviet troops. Ju-87 dive bombers continuously attacked columns of retreating units, sowing panic and inflicting heavy losses. By the end of June 23rd, the advanced units of Kleist's 1st Panzer Group had penetrated up to 60 kilometers deep. A real threat of encirclement of the main forces of the 5th and 6th Soviet armies arose. In this critical situation, the command of the Southwestern Front decided to conduct a large-scale counterattack with the forces of the Mechanized Corps. On June 24, 1941, an intense animation reigned at the headquarters of the Southwestern Front. Colonel General Kirponos bent over a map, dotted with markings and arrows. Red arrows, indicating the advance of German tank columns, deeply penetrated the positions of Soviet troops. Blue arrows drawn in pencil showed the plan for a counterattack. The front's military council made a decision that could change the course of the war that had begun: to launch a powerful counterattack on the flanks of Kleist's breakthrough group. The plan was audacious and large-scale. 5 mechanized corps were to deliver a concentrated blow to cut through the German tank wedge and destroy it piecemeal. "Comrade commanders, the enemy has broken through our defenses and is advancing in the direction of Lutsk, Rivne, and Dubno. Our task is to encircle and destroy the intruding group." Kirponos surveyed those present. "For this, we are launching a counterattack with all available mechanized corps." The front's staff directive envisaged a complex maneuver. The 8th and 15th Mechanized Corps were to strike from the south, from the Brody area, in the direction of Dubno. The 9th and 19th Corps were advancing from the north, from the Rivne area, to meet them. The 22nd Mechanized Corps was tasked with operating on the flank of the German group from the Lutsk area. The plan looked flawless on paper, but its implementation required filigree coordination of all units' actions. The Mechanized Corps were at a considerable distance from the concentration areas. They had to undertake multi-kilometer marches under enemy airstrikes. The front commander understood the complexity of the task but saw no alternative. "If we don't stop Kleist now, he will break through to Kiev," Kirponos told Chief of Staff General Prakayev. The directive of the Southwestern Front headquarters was transmitted to the troops on the night of June 24. Commanders of Mechanized Corps received orders for deployment and maneuvering. There was practically no time left for preparation. The counterattack was planned to begin as early as June 26th. General Ryabyshev, commander of the 8th Mechanized Corps, after studying the received order, experienced mixed feelings. On the one hand, his corps finally received a combat mission. On the other, the conditions for its execution caused serious concerns. The corps had to make a 150-kilometer march, concentrate in the designated area, and immediately engage in battle with an experienced enemy. "Comrade General, how will we supply the corps with fuel?" asked the Chief of Staff. This was a key question. Fuel reserves allowed only part of the route to be covered. The promised front fuel trucks had not yet arrived. Other mechanized corps experienced similar problems. The commander of the 15th Corps, General Carpezo, reported to the front headquarters about personnel shortages and technical problems with the new KV and T-34 tanks. Many vehicles required adjustment and minor repairs. Despite all difficulties, the Mechanized Corps began to advance to the starting lines. Columns of equipment stretched for tens of kilometers. German air reconnaissance immediately detected the movement of Soviet troops and reported to the command of Kleist's group. Colonel General Kleist, assessing the situation, decided to intensify the pace of the offensive to prevent Soviet tank formations from being able to organize for a counterattack. On the morning of June 23rd, Major General Dmitry Ivanovich Ryabyshev, commander of the 8th Mechanized Corps, received an order that changed the fate of his formation. The corps was to undertake a 150-kilometer march from the Drohobych area to Brody to strike at the advancing German tank units. There was practically no time for preparation. "We set off immediately," Ryabyshev announced at a meeting of division commanders. The march is to be conducted predominantly at night, with camouflage during the day. Maintain communication through delegates and mobile means. On the night of June 23rd, the columns of the 8th Mechanized Corps set off. Thousands of vehicles stretched along the roads of western Ukraine. Leading the way was General Mishanin's 12th Tank Division, followed by the 74th Rifle Division, with Colonel Vasilyev's 34th Tank Division bringing up the rear. Problems began almost immediately. Many tanks, especially the new KVs and T-34s, had limited engine life and were not designed for long marches. Driver mechanics, insufficiently familiar with the equipment, made operational errors. Engines overheated, and transmissions failed. Comrade General, in the 34th Division, 23 tanks already require repairs, reported Colonel Belly, the Corps Chief of Staff, at the end of the first day of the march. Even more serious was the fuel problem. Fuel reserves in the vehicle tanks quickly dwindled, and the promised frontline fuel tankers never arrived. Ryabyshev ordered every liter of fuel to be conserved, speed to be reduced, and engines to be turned off during halts. At dawn on June 24th, the Corps columns came under attack from German aviation. Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers attacked the vehicles stretched along the roads. Anti-aircraft defenses were catastrophically lacking, and fighter cover was absent. Disperse the vehicles! Use any cover! Motorcycle couriers transmitted along the columns. Tanks and vehicles drove off the roads, hiding in forest belts and ravines. This slowed movement but saved equipment from aerial destruction. Communication with higher headquarters was constantly interrupted. Radios worked intermittently, and wired communication was absent. Ryabyshev dispatched liaison officers to the front headquarters, but they either did not return or brought outdated information. By the end of June 24th, the leading elements of the Corps reached the Busk area, having covered about 100 kilometers. Here, Ryabyshev received an alarming intelligence report. German tank units were advancing significantly faster than expected and were already in the Dubno area. "We need to speed up the march," Ryabyshev told the Chief of Staff. "Otherwise, we will be late for the counterattack." But accelerating the movement was practically impossible. Fuel supplies were running out, and many vehicles required repair. Crew fatigue had reached its limit. People had not slept for 2 days. On the morning of June 25th, the Corps' advanced detachment, consisting of a reconnaissance battalion and a company of medium tanks, encountered a German motorized column in the Olesko area. A battle ensued. Soviet tank crews acted decisively, destroying several enemy armored personnel carriers and anti-tank guns. "This is just reconnaissance," reported the detachment commander, Major Korchagin. "The main German forces are moving further south." By the evening of June 25th, the 8th Mechanized Corps, having overcome enormous difficulties, reached its concentration area west of Brody. The tank crews were exhausted by the multi-kilometer march, but the main test lay ahead: battle with the tank aces of the Wehrmacht. The 9th and 19th Mechanized Corps received orders to advance almost simultaneously with the 8th. They were tasked with striking from the north, from the Rivne region, to meet Ryabyshev's units advancing from the south. The command's plan was to catch the German tank wedge in a vise and destroy it piecemeal. However, reality proved harsher than any plans. Major General Konstantin Rokossovsky's 9th Mechanized Corps was stationed in the Novorod-Volinsky area, 180 kilometers from the planned strike location. Major General Nikolai Feklenko's 19th Corps was even further, 200 kilometers away. Both formations faced an exhausting march over poor roads under continuous attacks from German aviation. Rokossovsky, upon receiving the order, immediately gathered his unit commanders. "The situation is critical," he said. "The enemy has broken through the front and is developing an offensive. Our Corps has been tasked with stopping it." The Corps commander was an experienced tankman, having endured the trials of Khalkhin Gol, but even he understood the complexity of the task. The technical condition of the machines left much to be desired. Many tanks needed repairs. Fuel supplies were limited, and the additional tankers promised by the front never arrived. The communication problem was particularly acute. In the 20th Tank Division, part of the Corps, only commanders' vehicles were equipped with radios. The situation in the 35th Tank Division was only slightly better. This critically limited command and control capabilities in combat. The columns of the 9th Mechanized Corps set out at dawn on June 24th. The 20th Tank Division led, followed by the 35th and the 131st Motorized Divisions. The march proceeded under the most difficult conditions. Narrow country roads, washed out by rains, turned into impassable sections. Heavy KVs and medium T-34s bogged down in the mud, consuming precious fuel. Light BT and T-26 tanks moved faster, but often broke down due to worn-out engines. From the air, the columns were continuously attacked by German bombers. Junkers dive-bombed the stretched-out vehicles, dropping bombs and strafing them with machine guns. Anti-aircraft defenses were catastrophically lacking, and fighter cover was absent. General Faklenko's 19th Mechanized Corps was in an even more difficult position. Its main forces, the 43rd Tank Division, were only completing their reorganization. Many crews were understaffed, and the tankmen had not had time to master the equipment. The Corps' 2nd Tank Division, the 40th, had only 40 tanks instead of the prescribed 320. Nevertheless, the Corps began its advance as ordered. The columns stretched for tens of kilometers. Communication between units was maintained mainly by motorcyclists and liaison delegates in automobiles. Radio communication worked intermittently and often was absent altogether. The Corps commanders had practically no information about the enemy. Intelligence reports were fragmentary and often outdated. Neither Rokossovsky nor Faklenko knew exactly where the main forces of the German tank divisions they were to fight were located. The coordination between the corps was no better. The front headquarters, overloaded with information and constantly changing its location, could not ensure clear control. Orders often arrived late or contradicted each other. By the end of June 25th, the advanced units of the 9th Mechanized Corps reached the Rivne area, having covered about 150 kilometers. Men and equipment were exhausted to the limit. Many tanks were left on the route due to breakdowns or lack of fuel. The 19th Corps lagged several hours behind, its leading units only approaching Rivne. Rokossovsky, assessing the situation, realized there was no time for rest and regrouping. German tanks had already broken through to Dubno. The 15th Mechanized Corps, under Major General Ignatiy Ivanovich Karpezo, was located in the Berdichev area, 180 kilometers from the planned strike. Upon receiving the order to advance on the evening of June 23rd, the Corps commander immediately brought the formation to combat readiness. The Corps included the 10th and 37th Tank Divisions, as well as the 212th Motorized Division. On paper, this was an impressive force. Over 700 tanks, including the latest KV and T-34 models. However, the real situation was far from ideal. Many vehicles required repairs, there was a shortage of spare parts, and the crews of the new tanks had not fully mastered the equipment. Karpezo, a seasoned general with experience from the Finnish campaign, understood the complexity of the task, but was determined to carry out the order. "Comrade commanders, we have been given the honor of stopping the fascist tanks. The fate of the front depends on us," he addressed his officers at a brief meeting before the march. The columns of the 15th Mechanized Corps set off on the night of June 24th. The 10th Tank Division of Colonel Ogurtsov led the way, followed by the 37th Tank and 212th Motorized Divisions. The march took place under extremely difficult conditions. Narrow roads prevented movement on a broad front, and columns stretched for many kilometers. At dawn, German air raids began. Dive bombers attacked the columns, inflicting significant losses. Despite all the difficulties, by the evening of June 25th, the advanced units of the Corps reached the Kozin area, having covered about 150 kilometers. Here, the first encounter with the enemy took place. The Corps' reconnaissance battalion clashed with a German motorized column. A fierce battle ensued. Soviet tank crews acted decisively, destroying several armored personnel carriers and anti-tank guns. The enemy was repelled, which instilled confidence in the soldiers. On the morning of June 26th, the 10th Tank Division, at the vanguard of the Corps, attacked German positions in the Dubno area. The strike was unexpected for the enemy. 34 tanks broke through the defenses and burst into the positions of the artillery regiment of the 11th Tank Division of the Wehrmacht. German anti-tank guns could not penetrate the armor of Soviet vehicles. "We drove the Fritz like rabbits. Their shells bounced off our tanks," recalled later Tank Company Commander Lieutenant Burtsev. Developing their success, the 10th Tank Division advanced 10 kilometers deep into the enemy's disposition, creating a threat to the rear of the German grouping. This was one of the few successes of Soviet troops in the first days of the war. The command of Kleist's 1st Panzer Group was forced to urgently redeploy reserves to eliminate the breakthrough. However, the initial success could not be developed. The 37th Tank Division, following the 10th, encountered serious problems. Many vehicles were left behind on the march due to technical malfunctions and lack of fuel. The 212th Motorized Division, which was supposed to consolidate the success of the tank crews, lagged behind and could not support the breakthrough in time. By noon on June 26th, the situation of the 10th Tank Division became critical. Having broken deep into the enemy's defenses, it found itself semi-encircled. The Germans brought up anti-tank artillery and began methodically shelling Soviet tanks. Enemy aircraft launched continuous strikes. Communication with the Corps command was interrupted, and coordination of actions was disrupted. "We fell into a fire trap," recalled Tank Battalion Commander Captain Morozov. "The Germans were hitting us from all sides, and there was no support." By the evening of June 26th, the 10th Tank Division suffered heavy losses and was forced to retreat. Of the 120 tanks that participated in the breakthrough, less than half returned. The rest remained on the battlefield, damaged, burned, or abandoned due to lack of fuel. Major General Semyon Mikhailovich Kondrasev's 22nd Mechanized Corps was located in the Lutsk area at the beginning of the war. According to its authorized strength, the Corps should have had over 600 tanks, but the real picture was dismal. The 41st Tank Division had only 19 tanks, predominantly outdated BT-5s and BT-7s. The 215th Motorized Division had no tanks at all. Only the 215th Tank Division was relatively well equipped, with about 150 vehicles. But even among these, modern KV and T-34 tanks were few and far between. The Corps is practically not ready for serious combat operations, Kondrasev reported to the front headquarters as early as June 21st. But his warnings went unheeded. When the war broke out, the 22nd Mechanized Corps was the first among the tank formations of the Southwestern Front to engage in battle with superior enemy forces. On the morning of June 23rd, advanced units of the German 14th Tank Division broke through to Lutsk. By order of the Front Command, the 41st Tank Division advanced to meet them. The forces were incomparable. Against nearly 200 German tanks, there were 19 Soviet vehicles. "I know there are few of us, but there's nowhere to retreat. Lutsk is behind us," the division commander, Colonel Pavlov, addressed the tank crews before the battle. The crews understood what they were getting into. Many said goodbye to each other, as if sensing the inevitable. The battle was short and brutal. Soviet tank crews fought heroically, but the enemy's superiority in numbers and organization was overwhelming. German tanks operated cohesively, supported by artillery and aviation. Each Soviet tank was attacked by 3 or 4 German vehicles. "It wasn't a battle, but a slaughter," recalled a surviving driver mechanic, Sergeant Nikulin, later. "Our tanks burned one after another. We knocked out several German vehicles, but the forces were too unequal." By noon, practically nothing remained of the 41st Tank Division. The surviving crews retreated to Lutsk, where defenses were hastily being organized. The Corps Command threw the 215th Tank Division into battle, but even it could not stop the German offensive. The tank crews of the 215th Division engaged in battle on the move, without reconnaissance or artillery support. The Germans met them with an organized anti-tank defense. Light BTs became easy prey for anti-tank guns. Even the few KVs and T-34s, technically superior to German tanks, could not turn the tide. The lack of crew experience and the absence of interaction with other branches of service took their toll. By the end of June 23rd, the 22nd Mechanized Corps had lost more than half of its tanks. Lutsk had to be abandoned. The remnants of the Corps retreated eastward, trying to consolidate on new lines. Communication with the front headquarters was lost. Orders arrived with great delay or not at all. "We fought blindly, not knowing the overall situation and having no clear objective," Kondrasev wrote in his memoirs. The situation was exacerbated by an acute shortage of fuel and ammunition. Many technically sound tanks had to be abandoned due to lack of fuel. On June 24th, the remnants of the 22nd Mechanized Corps received orders to counterattack the enemy in the Rivne area, acting in conjunction with the 9th and 19th Mechanized Corps. But by this point, the Corps had only about 40 combat-ready tanks left, less than 10% of its authorized strength. Nevertheless, the tank crews carried out the order. On June 25th, they attacked a German motorized column east of Rivne. The surprise of the strike brought temporary success. Several dozen enemy vehicles and armored personnel carriers were destroyed. But soon the main forces of the German 13th Tank Division arrived, and the Soviet tank crews were forced to retreat, suffering new losses. On June 26, 1941, the counteroffensive of Soviet Mechanized Corps against Kleist's tank divisions began. The dawn of that day found General Ryabyshev's 8th Mechanized Corps west of Brody. The tank crews, despite an exhausting march, were preparing for a decisive battle. The combat order was simple and harsh. Attack the enemy in the direction of Dubno. Link up with the 9th and 19th Mechanized Corps advancing from the north, and encircle and destroy the enemy grouping that had broken through. The 12th Tank Division was the first to attack. 150 vehicles spread out in a line moved west. Heavy KVs and medium T-34s led the way, followed by light BTs and T-26s. The Germans did not expect such a powerful blow. The advanced units of the Wehrmacht's 13th Tank Division, which met the Soviet attack, were crushed. The KV crews were particularly effective. German anti-tank guns proved powerless against their armor. "We went headlong, sweeping everything in our path," Lieutenant Brezhnikov, commander of a tank company, later recalled. "German shells bounced off our vehicles like peas." By noon, the 12th Tank Division had advanced 15 kilometers, creating a breach in the German defenses. The 34th Tank Division rushed into the breach. It seemed that success was near. However, the situation soon began to change. The German command quickly assessed the threat and committed reserves to battle. Dive bombers attacked Soviet tank columns from the air. The lack of anti-aircraft cover and fighter aircraft was becoming increasingly acute. At the same time, supply problems began to emerge. Fuel supplies in the tanks were running out, and fuel trucks could not reach the advanced units due to continuous air raids. "I have half an hour's worth of fuel left for battle," reported Major Lukin, commander of a tank battalion. "What should we do next?" Ryabyshev made a difficult decision. Either continue the offensive on the last drops of fuel, risking losing equipment, or suspend the attack until fuel arrived. At the same time, on the northern direction, Rokossovsky's 9th Mechanized Corps entered the battle. Its 20th Tank Division attacked German positions in the area of Klavan, 30 kilometers north of Dubno. The blow was unexpected for the enemy. Soviet tank crews broke through the first line of defense and advanced 10 kilometers. However, they soon encountered organized anti-tank defenses. The Germans, using the terrain, skillfully positioned anti-tank guns. Light Soviet tanks became easy prey. They let us get within 500 to 600 meters and then hit us in the side, said surviving tank crewman Sergeant Pavlov. Our vehicles caught fire one after another. The 35th Tank Division, following the 20th, got stuck on the march due to fuel problems. The gap between the divisions widened, and coordination was disrupted. Rokossovsky, understanding the danger, ordered the 20th Tank Division to consolidate its gains and not advance further without support. General Feklenko's 19th Mechanized Corps entered the battle late. Its advanced units only reached the line of contact with the enemy by the evening of June 26th. The 43rd Tank Division attacked German positions east of Lutsk, but without proper reconnaissance and artillery preparation. The result was disastrous. The division came under a flanking attack from German tanks and suffered heavy losses. On the southern direction, General Carpezzo's 15th Mechanized Corps achieved the greatest success on the first day of the counteroffensive. Its 10th Tank Division broke through to the outskirts of Dubno, creating a real threat to the rear of the German grouping. The German command was forced to urgently transfer reserves to eliminate the breakthrough. However, by evening, the situation of the 10th Tank Division became critical. Having broken away from the main forces of the Corps, it found itself in a semi-encirclement. Ammunition was running out, and fuel remained for only a few hours. Communication with the Corps command was interrupted. We broke through too deeply and found ourselves alone against the entire German army, recalled Captain Morozov, commander of a tank battalion. By the end of the first day of the counteroffensive, the situation remained uncertain. Soviet Mechanized Corps achieved local successes, but no general breakthrough occurred. The German command, initially caught off guard by the power of the Soviet strike, quickly regrouped its forces and organized an effective defense. The main problem for Soviet tank crews was the lack of coordination between the corps. The front headquarters, overloaded with information and constantly changing its location, could not ensure effective control. Communication was intermittent, and orders were delayed. The Corps acted disjointedly, without supporting each other. On the evening of June 26th, General Kirponos held a meeting with the army commanders. The situation demanded immediate decisions. The counteroffensive had not achieved its goals, but it could not be stopped either. That would mean the final loss of initiative. Logistics is the blood of war. This simple truth, known to commanders since the time of Napoleon, was fully manifested during the counterattack of Soviet Mechanized Corps near Dubno-Lutsk-Rovno. On the morning of June 27, 1941, when tank formations were supposed to develop the initial success, most of the vehicles stood with empty tanks. Fuel, this vital elixir of mechanized troops, simply did not reach the advanced units. The 8th Mechanized Corps of General Ryabyshev, which had broken through the German defenses the day before, was practically paralyzed. Of the 180 tanks that participated in the breakthrough, only 37 could move. The rest stopped with empty tanks. Commanders desperately sent vehicles to search for fuel, but fuel trucks could not break through the zones of German airstrikes. Drivers risked their lives, collecting precious fuel drop by drop from damaged and abandoned vehicles. German aviation, like vultures, circled over the immobilized Soviet tanks, methodically destroying them one by one. The situation was even more dramatic in the 15th Mechanized Corps. The 10th Tank Division, which had deeply penetrated the enemy's positions, was completely cut off from the rear. The division commander's radio messages became increasingly desperate. "No fuel, ammunition running out, holding on with our last strength." Attempts to break through a corridor to the encircled tankers were unsuccessful. The Germans quickly transferred anti-tank artillery and fresh tank units to the breakthrough site. The crews, having expended their last shells, abandoned their immobilized vehicles and broke through to their own in small groups. Many did not make it. The supply problem was exacerbated by the complete lack of coordination between rear services and combat units. Fuel and ammunition depots were located 80 to 100 kilometers from the front line. There was a catastrophic shortage of motor transport. The few fuel trucks that managed to be sent to the front often fell victim to German airstrikes or came under fire from breakthrough enemy tank groups. We knew that somewhere there was both fuel and ammunition, but they simply did not reach us, recalled later Major Lukin, a tank battalion commander. No less acute was the problem with ammunition. KV and T-34 tanks, technically superior to German vehicles, often found themselves helpless due to the lack of shells. "I have 3 shells left," reported Lieutenant Brajnikov, a tank company commander on the evening of June 27th. "What do I do next?" There was no answer. Communication with the command post was interrupted. Rokossovsky's 9th Mechanized Corps faced the same problems. The 20th Tank Division, entrenched on the achieved lines, waited for the delivery of fuel and ammunition. But the rear services could not cope with the task. "We were like a boxer with his hands tied," Rokossovsky figuratively expressed in his post-war memoirs. "We saw the enemy, knew his weaknesses, but could not strike." The situation with spare parts proved critical. New KV and T-34 tanks, which had just entered service, often broke down due to technical reasons. Tracks broke, engines overheated, transmissions failed. Repair crews did not have the necessary parts and tools. Many vehicles that received minor damage, which under normal conditions could have been eliminated in a few hours, remained on the battlefield. They were either blown up so as not to fall into enemy hands, or they became German trophies. The lack of evacuation means exacerbated the problem. There were practically no special tractors for evacuating damaged tanks. It was necessary to use serviceable combat vehicles, which further reduced the strike power of the Corps. On June 28th, when it became clear that the counterattack had stalled, the front command decided to withdraw the mechanized corps from battle. But even the retreat turned into a logistical nightmare. Thousands of units of equipment moved along narrow roads, creating giant traffic jams. German aviation inflicted continuous strikes on the retreating columns. Losses multiplied with each hour. Communication is the nervous system of an army. In peacetime, this principle of military science often remained just a line in regulations. But in the chaos of the first days of the war, the lack of reliable communication turned into a catastrophe, especially for mechanized formations whose actions required precise coordination. On June 26, 1941, when Soviet Tank Corps launched a counterattack, the troop control system practically disintegrated. The headquarters of the Southwestern Front, relocating from Ternopil to Proskurov, lost stable communication with armies and corps. Radios worked intermittently, and wired communication was disrupted by airstrikes and enemy sabotage groups. "We were as if blind and deaf," Major Vasilyev, Chief of Communications of the 8th Mechanized Corps, later recalled. Tank columns moved forward without current information about the enemy or neighbors. Commanders made decisions blindly, relying on outdated data or none at all. The problem was particularly acute at the level of interaction between corps. Ryabashev's 8th Mechanized Corps, attacking from the south, did not know the exact position of Rokossovsky's 9th Corps, moving to meet it from the north. The distance between them was less than 50 kilometers, but coordinating attacks was impossible. Communication was absent. "I couldn't understand where the neighbors were," Rokossovsky wrote in his memoirs. "I sent liaison officers, but they either didn't return or brought outdated information." Within the Corps themselves, the situation was little better. Most Soviet tanks, especially older models, did not have radios. Commanders could only control units using flags, signal flares, or personal example. In intense combat, when visibility is limited by smoke and dust, such methods proved largely ineffective. Even where radios were present, their performance left much to be desired. Outdated equipment, a shortage of spare parts, and a lack of experienced radio operators all led to constant failures. German electronic warfare systems jammed main frequencies. Often, false orders in Russian were broadcast, causing even greater confusion. At one point, I received a radio order to retreat, recounted Captain Morozov, a tank battalion commander. But the voice seemed suspicious to me. I demanded the code word be repeated, and the connection was cut. It was a German provocation. German tank units had an undeniable advantage in command and control. Every tank was equipped with a radio, allowing commanders to maintain continuous communication with units. The system of codes and frequency changes made interception and jamming difficult. Liaison officers on motorcycles and light armored vehicles duplicated radio messages, ensuring reliable transmission of orders. The lack of reliable intelligence exacerbated command problems. Soviet commanders often did not know exactly what enemy forces they would face. Air reconnaissance was virtually non-existent. Air superiority belonged to the Luftwaffe. Ground reconnaissance groups operated disjointedly, and their reports did not always reach headquarters. "We attacked blindly," recalled Lieutenant Brezhnikov, a tank company commander. "We thought we were facing motorized infantry, but we ran into an anti-tank line with dozens of guns." By the end of June 27th, control of the counterattack was practically lost. Mechanized corps acted in isolation, without supporting each other. Local successes of individual units could not be developed due to a lack of coordination. The German command, on the other hand, quickly identified the directions of Soviet strikes and promptly moved reserves to threatened sectors. Attempts by front headquarters to restore control were unsuccessful. Liaison officers sent to the troops often could not find the command posts of corps and divisions, which changed positions under airstrikes. Orders were delayed by many hours, losing their relevance. The collapse of the command and control system became one of the main reasons for the failure of the Soviet mechanized corps' counterattack. The tank armada, which on paper numbered thousands of vehicles, turned into scattered groups that the Germans destroyed piecemeal. Air. That was the decisive factor in the tank battle near Dubno. On June 26, 1941, the sky over the battlefield belonged to the Luftwaffe. German air aces turned the blue firmament into a deadly zone for Soviet tank crews. German Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers, dubbed Stukas by the soldiers, descended on columns of Soviet equipment with a chilling wail, sowing terror and destruction. The sound of their sirens, specially installed for psychological impact, paralyzed the will of inexperienced fighters. "It was a real hell," recalled driver-mechanic Nikolai Kovalev of the 8th Mechanized Corps. "The ground was shaking, explosions all around, and you're sitting in a red-hot iron box waiting to be hit." The Luftwaffe's tactics were perfected. Groups of 6 to 8 aircraft continuously relieved each other over the battlefield. While some were approaching their targets, others were already returning to airfields to resupply. This conveyor of death operated with German punctuality. Tank columns on the march proved especially vulnerable. Stretched out for many kilometers, without anti-aircraft cover, they became ideal targets. German pilots methodically targeted the lead and trailing vehicles. Damaged tanks blocked the road, creating a traffic jam, after which the systematic destruction of the remaining vehicles began. "They hunted us as if on a training ground," said Tank Company Commander Lieutenant Sergei Burtsev. "We tried to disperse, to use the terrain's folds, but the open Ukrainian steppe offered no cover." The German Henschel HS-129 anti-tank aircraft posed a particular danger. Armed with 30mm cannons, they dived at Soviet tanks from the rear, striking the less protected aft section and engine compartment. Light BT and T-26 tanks burned after 1 or 2 hits. Even the newest KV and T-34, whose frontal armor was invulnerable to German tanks, proved defenseless against airstrikes. Soviet fighter aviation was virtually absent over the battlefield. Most of the aircraft had been destroyed in the first hours of the war at airfields. The few fighters that did take to the air operated sporadically, without coordination with ground forces. They became easy prey for experienced German aces in Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Equipment losses from airstrikes were catastrophic. According to historians, up to 30% of Soviet tanks during the counterattack near Dubno were destroyed or damaged precisely by enemy aviation. But even more terrible was the psychological effect. Continuous bombings exhausted people, undermining morale. Tank crews, lacking experience in countering aviation, often abandoned technically sound vehicles at the mere sound of approaching aircraft. "The worst thing is helplessness," admitted Sergeant Ivan Petrenko. "You can fight enemy tanks, but against aircraft, you are powerless." Commanders tried to organize anti-aircraft defense on their own. Tanks stopped. Crews fired anti-aircraft machine guns at diving aircraft. But the effectiveness of such defense was minimal. Machine gun bursts rarely hit their targets, and stopped vehicles became even more vulnerable to bomb strikes. Air superiority gave the German command a colossal advantage in reconnaissance. Focke-Wulf FW-189 spotter planes constantly circled over the battlefield, transmitting precise data on the movement of Soviet troops. Any concentration of tanks was immediately detected and subjected to attack. Soviet commanders, on the contrary, operated blindly, having no information about either the enemy or their neighbors. German anti-tank defenses came as a real shock to Soviet tank crews. Unlike the Red Army, where anti-tank weapons were evenly distributed along the front, the Germans created deeply echeloned anti-tank areas at probable directions of Soviet attacks. The core of these areas consisted of 37mm PaK-36 anti-tank guns and more powerful 50mm PaK-38s, capable of hitting medium Soviet tanks at distances up to 800 meters. German crews positioned their guns in a staggered pattern, creating overlapping fields of fire. Each position was meticulously camouflaged and offered a 360-degree view. Wehrmacht artillerymen did not open fire on leading vehicles, allowing them to penetrate deep into the defenses, and then cut off the main forces by knocking out the trailing tanks. This created a peculiar cauldron within which Soviet vehicles were systematically destroyed. "It wasn't a defense, it was a real massacre," recalled Lieutenant Kravchenko, commander of a tank company from the 10th Tank Division. "We entered a hollow, and suddenly fire opened on us from all sides. Shells hit the sides and rear. In 10 minutes, I lost 7 out of 10 vehicles." The Germans were particularly effective in utilizing terrain features. Anti-tank guns were placed on reverse slopes of hills, in forest belts, and on the outskirts of settlements. Tanks, overcoming natural obstacles, slowed down, becoming easy targets. German artillerymen knew the distances to landmarks precisely and fired aimed shots. The anti-tank defense system was supplemented by engineering barriers, minefields, anti-tank ditches, escarps. These directed the movement of Soviet tanks into pre-prepared corridors of death, where anti-tank fire was concentrated. Where Soviet tankers managed to break through the first line of defense, they were met by a second echelon, heavy 88mm anti-aircraft guns, temporarily repurposed for anti-tank firing. These powerful guns could penetrate the armor of any Soviet tank, including the newest KVs, from a distance of up to 2 kilometers. "We thought we had broken through," said Sergeant Petrenko, a driver mechanic who miraculously survived such a battle. Suddenly, the leading KV burst into flames. A shell went right through it. We couldn't even see where they were firing from. The distance was so great. German infantry was also well prepared for fighting tanks. Each platoon included crews with anti-tank rifles. In close combat, bundles of grenades and Molotov cocktails were used. Wehrmacht soldiers acted decisively and cohesively, attacking Soviet tanks in groups of 5 to 6 men from different directions. The statistics of Soviet armored vehicle losses from anti-tank artillery fire were disheartening. According to historians, up to 60% of all tanks lost during the counterattack were destroyed by artillery fire. Losses were particularly high among light BT and T-26 tanks, whose armor could not withstand even 37mm shells. The newest Soviet KV and T-34 tanks, theoretically superior in armor protection to any German vehicles, often fell victim to tactical miscalculations. Commanders, lacking experience, threw them into attack without reconnaissance and artillery support. The Germans quickly identified the vulnerabilities of these vehicles: weak side and rear armor, inconvenient crew visibility and internal layout, and unreliable transmission. On June 27, 1941, the tank battle in the Dubno-Lutsk-Rovno area reached its climax. The sun had barely risen above the horizon when hundreds of steel machines from both sides moved towards each other. The ground trembled from the roar of tracks, the air filled with the roar of engines and the cannonade of shots. This was the day when two tank schools, two military doctrines, two world views clashed in a deadly embrace. General Ryabashev's 8th Mechanized Corps, having partially restored its combat capability after receiving limited fuel supplies, resumed its offensive on Dubno. 60 tanks, predominantly heavy KVs and medium T-34s, attacked the positions of the German 13th Panzer Division. Soviet vehicles advanced in 3 waves, aiming to break through the enemy's defenses with a massive strike. "We believed in the armor of our KVs," recalled Major Volkov, commander of a tank battalion later. "German shells bounced off the frontal armor like peas. We moved forward, sweeping everything in our path. Initially, the attack developed successfully. German 37mm anti-tank guns proved powerless against Soviet heavy tanks. KV crews, feeling their superiority, acted boldly, sometimes even recklessly. They literally crushed German artillery with their tracks and shot armored personnel carriers and infantry at point-blank range. However, the German command quickly regrouped its forces. 88mm anti-aircraft guns, temporarily reassigned to anti-tank firing, were brought into battle. These powerful cannons opened fire from a distance of 1.5 kilometers, beyond the reach of the Soviet tanks' guns. "The lead KV caught fire first," said Sergeant Kravtsov, a driver mechanic. "A shell pierced the turret clean through. We didn't even understand where the shots were coming from. Then other vehicles started to burst into flames." Simultaneously, German PZ-3 and PZ-4 tanks attacked from the flanks. They were inferior to the Soviet KVs and T-34s in armor protection and firepower, but superior in maneuverability and coordination. German crews skillfully used the terrain, fired from short stops, constantly changing positions. Soviet tankers, on the contrary, acted straightforwardly. Accustomed to frontal assaults, they had no experience in maneuver warfare. Commanders could not effectively control their units due to the lack of radio communication between vehicles. Each crew essentially fought alone. "We saw how German tanks interacted with each other," recalled Lieutenant Sokolov, commander of a tank platoon. 3 or 4 vehicles maneuvered as a single unit, covering each other with fire. We couldn't even inform a neighboring tank about danger. By noon, the attack of the 8th Mechanized Corps had faltered. Of the 60 vehicles that began the offensive, fewer than 20 returned to their lines. The rest remained on the battlefield, damaged, burned, or abandoned due to technical malfunctions. In the northern direction, Rokossovsky's 9th Mechanized Corps also attempted a breakthrough. The 20th Tank Division attacked German positions in the Klevan area. The strike was well prepared. Before the attack, enemy positions were shelled by artillery, and tanks advanced under the cover of motorized riflemen. Rokossovsky, an experienced commander, understood the importance of combined arms interaction. Unlike other corps, his tanks did not go into battle alone. Artillery suppressed enemy firing points, infantry identified camouflaged anti-tank guns, and sappers cleared passages through minefields. This tactic brought some success. The 20th Tank Division broke through the first line of German defenses and advanced 8 kilometers. However, they failed to develop the success. The 35th Tank Division, which was supposed to support the breakthrough, got stuck on the march due to fuel problems. By the evening of June 27th, the situation of the Soviet Mechanized Corps became critical. Equipment losses reached 50 to 60%. Fuel and ammunition supplies were running low. Communication between units was practically non-existent. The front command had lost control of the situation. The German command, on the contrary, acted decisively and coordinately. Having identified the directions of the main Soviet strikes, Colonel General Kleist redeployed reserves to the threatened sectors. Aviation continuously bombed Soviet columns, and artillery fired at identified concentrations of equipment. German anti-tank units were particularly effective. They did not engage in open combat with Soviet tanks, which surpassed them in firepower, but set ambushes on probable routes of movement. Camouflaged guns opened fire from close range at the sides and rear of the tanks, hitting the most vulnerable spots. It was as if they anticipated our actions, recalled Major Lukin, commander of a tank battalion. Every time we changed the direction of attack, they were already waiting for us. On June 28th, the counterattack of the Soviet Mechanized Corps finally ran out of steam. Tank units, having suffered enormous losses, retreated eastward, trying to avoid encirclement. German tank divisions resumed their offensive, seeking to develop their success. The tank battle in the Dubno-Lutsk-Rovno area became the first serious test for Soviet armored forces in the Great Patriotic War, and this exam was failed. Despite numerical superiority and the presence of superior equipment, the Mechanized Corps of the Southwestern Front could not stop the German offensive. By June 28, 1941, it became definitively clear. The counterattack by Soviet Mechanized Corps had suffered a crushing defeat. All factors determining success in modern warfare had combined against the Red Army. As if in a tragic kaleidoscope, problems of supply, lack of communication, German air superiority, and the enemy's tactical advantage merged. Colonel General Kirponos, commander of the Southwestern Front, receiving contradictory reports from various sectors of the battle, tried to save the remnants of his tank formations. It is necessary to withdraw the Mechanized Corps from battle and consolidate on the Horin River line, read his order, issued at 6 in the morning. But even this order did not reach all commanders. Ryabashev's 8th Mechanized Corps, having exhausted its last reserves of fuel and ammunition, retreated in scattered groups. Of the more than 700 tanks with which the Corps began the counterattack, fewer than 100 remained operational. Carpezo's 15th Mechanized Corps virtually ceased to exist as a combat unit. Its 10th Tank Division, which had broken through to Dubno, was surrounded and destroyed. Only individual crews managed to break through to their own forces. Rokossovsky's 9th Mechanized Corps, acting most organizedly, managed to withdraw the majority of its surviving equipment. But even its losses exceeded 60%. The German command, taking advantage of the defeat of the Soviet tank formations, immediately resumed its offensive. Kleist's 1st Panzer Group, having repelled the counterattack, now had an open road to the east. By the evening of June 28th, forward units of the 14th Panzer Division of the Wehrmacht occupied Rivne, and the 13th Panzer Division pressed towards Ostro. A real threat of a deep encirclement of the entire southwestern front emerged. One of the main reasons for the collapse of the counterattack was the catastrophic discrepancy between the theory and practice of employing large tank formations. Pre-war doctrine assumed the massive use of armored forces for a decisive breakthrough of enemy defenses. But this doctrine did not take into account many practical aspects, from the organization of supply to tactical interaction with other branches of troops. We prepared for war by textbooks, but had to fight in reality, one of the surviving battalion commanders bitterly remarked. The mechanized corps entered battle in a scattered manner, without proper reconnaissance and artillery support. Tanks attacked the enemy, head-on, without using maneuver and interaction between units. Crews, insufficiently trained and lacking combat experience, could not fully realize the potential of their machines. Even the technically superior German tanks KV and T-34 did not save the situation. The best equipment in the world is useless if it is not used correctly, General Rokossovsky noted in his analysis of the battle. The tragedy also lay in the fact that many problems were evident even before the war. The experience of battles in Spain, at Khalkhin Gol, and the Soviet-Finnish War provided rich material for conclusions. But the country's military-political leadership was unable or unwilling to draw the right lessons from it. The mass repressions of the late 30s deprived the army of experienced commanders capable of critically assessing the situation and proposing necessary changes. As a result, by June 41, the Red Army had a huge number of tanks but did not know how to use them effectively. The decision to conduct a counterattack in the Dubno-Lutsk-Rivne area was strategically sound. If successfully implemented, it could have inflicted serious damage on the German tank grouping and delayed its advance to the east. But the implementation of this plan proved catastrophic. The mechanized corps, thrown into battle without preparation and coordination, were broken piecemeal. The German command, initially concerned by the scale of the Soviet counterattack, quickly assessed the enemy's weaknesses and skillfully exploited them. Airstrikes on marching columns, anti-tank ambushes on routes of movement, cutting off tanks from infantry and artillery. These tactical techniques succeeded time and again. By the end of June 1941, the tank formations of the Southwestern Front had virtually ceased to exist as an organized force. Of the almost 3,000 tanks available to the 5 mechanized corps on the eve of the war, fewer than 400 remained operational. Most of the vehicles were lost irretrievably, burned, knocked out, or abandoned due to technical malfunctions and lack of fuel. Losses were particularly heavy in the newest KV and T-34 tanks, which industry had only begun to produce in significant quantities. Human losses were also enormous. Thousands of tank crews died in burning vehicles, were captured, or went missing. Many commanders, unwilling to admit defeat, continued to throw their last reserves into battle, exacerbating the catastrophe. Only a few, like Rokossovsky, managed to maintain composure and withdraw the maximum amount of surviving equipment and personnel from battle. On June 29th, 41st, the tragic finale of the tank battle near Dubno-Lutsk-Rovno arrived. The mechanized corps of the Southwestern Front, defeated in the counterattack, retreated eastward, trying to avoid complete encirclement. German tank divisions, taking advantage of the situation, rapidly advanced, creating a threat of deep encirclement of the entire grouping of Soviet troops. The 8th Mechanized Corps of General Ryabyshev retreated in scattered groups in the direction of Tarnopol. Of the 700 tanks available at the beginning of the operation, no more than 80 remained in service. The rest were knocked out, burned, or abandoned due to lack of fuel and technical malfunctions. We retreated, holding back the pressing enemy with rearguard battles, recalled Tank Battalion Commander Major Volkov. Every kilometer was paid for with blood. We were running out of ammunition and fuel, but the men fought to the last. The 15th Mechanized Corps of General Carpezo practically ceased to exist as a combat unit. Its 10th Tank Division, which broke through to Dubno on the first day of the counterattack, was encircled. Most of the tank crews died in unequal battles or were captured. Only individual crews managed to break through to their own. "We broke through in small groups, at night," recounted mechanic driver Sergeant Petrenko. "It was impossible to move during the day. German planes hunted every vehicle. Many tank crews walked, abandoning their equipment. The 9th Mechanized Corps of General Rokossovsky managed to withdraw most of the surviving equipment across the Horin River. The experienced commander organized rearguard battles, holding back the enemy and ensuring the retreat of the main forces. Thanks to his skillful actions, about a third of the Corps' tanks and most of the personnel were saved. Rokossovsky acted like a true military leader," recalled a liaison officer of the front headquarters, Captain Sergeyev. "In a critical situation, he did not lose his composure, competently organized the retreat, minimizing losses." The 22nd Mechanized Corps, which was the first to take the blow of German tanks, effectively ceased to exist. Individual groups of tank crews, having lost contact with the command, tried to break through eastward on their own. Many were encircled and died in unequal battles. The 19th Mechanized Corps, which did not have time to fully deploy for the counterattack, retreated in relative order. However, its losses were also significant. More than half of the tanks and about a third of the personnel. The German command, taking advantage of the defeat of the Soviet tank formations, increased the pace of the offensive. Kleist's 1st Panzer Group, overcoming the resistance of the rearguards, rapidly advanced eastward. On June 30th, its advanced units occupied Ostro and reached the approaches to the old Soviet-Polish border. The Soviet command, realizing the scale of the catastrophe, tried to organize a new line of defense along the Sluch and Horin rivers. But there was a catastrophic lack of forces for this. The Mechanized Corps, which formed the basis of the front's mobile troops, were defeated. Rifle divisions, exhausted by continuous battles and marches, could not withstand the onslaught of German tank wedges. On July 1st, 41st, German tanks broke through to the Novograd-Volinsky fortified area, the last serious line of defense before Kiev. A real threat of encirclement of the entire grouping of Soviet troops in right bank Ukraine arose. The tank battle in the Dubno-Lutsk-Rovno area became one of the largest in the initial period of the Great Patriotic War. In terms of the scale of forces involved, especially from the Soviet side, it surpassed many battles of World War II. However, unlike the famous Battle of Kursk or the Battle of Prokhorovka, this tragic page of history remained little known for a long time. Soviet losses in this battle were catastrophic. Of the almost 3,000 tanks available to the 5 mechanized corps of the Southwestern Front on the eve of the war, less than 400 remained in service by early July. Most of the vehicles were lost irrevocably, destroyed in battles or abandoned during the retreat. The final price of the tank battle near Dubno-Lutsk-Rovno proved truly terrible for Soviet troops. By July 1st, 1941, 5 mechanized corps of the Southwestern Front had effectively ceased to exist as combat units. Of the nearly 3,000 tanks listed in their composition on the eve of the war, no more than 400 vehicles remained in service. Moreover, most of the newest KVs and T-34s, which constituted the pride of Soviet armored forces, were irretrievably lost. Analyzing the structure of losses, military historians note that about 30% of Soviet tanks were destroyed by enemy aircraft, up to 60% were knocked out by anti-tank artillery, and only 10% were lost in direct tank duels. A significant number of technically sound vehicles had to be abandoned during the retreat due to lack of fuel or minor breakdowns. Human losses proved no less severe. According to various estimates, the Mechanized Corps lost up to 70% of their personnel. Thousands of tank crews perished in burning vehicles, were captured, or went missing. Particularly painful was the loss of experienced mid-level commanders, battalion and company commanders, who could not be quickly replaced. German losses appeared incomparably smaller. Kleist's 1st Panzer Group lost about 100 tanks irretrievably during the battle, and approximately the same number sustained damage of varying severity. Considering that the group numbered about 600 vehicles at the start of the operation, these losses amounted to approximately 30%, a significant but not critical figure. It is noteworthy that the greatest damage to German tank units was inflicted precisely by the newest Soviet KV and T-34 tanks. Their powerful armor proved invulnerable to standard Wehrmacht anti-tank weapons. German commanders had to employ heavy artillery or organize special hunting groups to combat these vehicles. The strategic consequences of the defeat of the Soviet Mechanized Corps proved catastrophic. Having destroyed the main tank forces of the Southwestern Front, Kleist's 1st Panzer Group gained freedom of maneuver in the Kiev direction. By mid-July, German tanks had reached the distant approaches to the capital of Ukraine, creating a threat of encirclement for the entire grouping of Soviet troops on the right bank. This defeat also had long-term consequences for the entire 1941 campaign. Having lost a significant portion of its tank forces in the first weeks of the war, the Red Army lost the ability to conduct major counterattacks and was forced to switch to strategic defense along the entire Soviet-German front. The tank battle near Dubno-Lutsk-Rovno became the first harsh lesson of the war for Soviet armored forces. Analyzing the causes of the defeat, military historians identify several key factors that collectively led to the catastrophe. First and foremost, this was the fundamental contradiction between theory and practice in the application of large tank formations. Pre-war doctrine assumed massive strikes by mechanized corps against a breakthrough enemy. But in practice, these corps proved incapable of rapid maneuver and coordinated actions. The discrepancy between the authorized strength and the actual availability of equipment created an illusion of power that did not, in fact, exist. The front command, planning a counterattack, operated with figures of 3,000 tanks, although there were significantly fewer combat-ready vehicles. The problem of troop control manifested itself particularly acutely. The lack of reliable communication between formations, units, and even individual vehicles turned the well-conceived plan of a counterattack into chaotic actions of scattered groups. Mechanized corps attacked the enemy not simultaneously but sequentially, which allowed the Germans to defeat them piecemeal. Tank unit commanders lacking up-to-date information about the enemy and neighboring units made decisions blindly, often driving their units into traps. The logistical support system completely collapsed in the first days of the war. Tank columns, having exhausted their range, stopped without fuel. Ammunition did not reach forward units. Repair services could not cope with the flow of damaged equipment. Dozens of technically sound tanks had to be abandoned during retreat due to lack of fuel or minor breakdowns. German air superiority was another decisive factor in the defeat. Junkers 87 dive bombers mercilessly hunted Soviet tank columns, inflicting heavy losses. The lack of anti-aircraft cover and fighter aircraft made the tank crews defenseless against airstrikes. German anti-tank defenses proved much more effective than the Soviet command had anticipated. Anti-tank guns set up in ambushes on probable routes of Soviet tanks inflicted heavy losses. The light BT and T-26 tanks, which constituted the majority of the Soviet tank fleet, proved particularly vulnerable. The level of training of personnel did not correspond to the complexity of combat tasks. Many crews had not had time to master the new equipment. Commanders lacked experience in controlling large tank formations in battle. Interaction with infantry, artillery, and aviation was practically non-existent. Tanks often attacked the enemy alone, without reconnaissance or fire support. Despite the catastrophic outcome, the battle near Dubno-Lutsk-Rovno also had positive consequences for the further course of the war. It became a harsh but necessary lesson for the Soviet command. By the autumn of '41, a revision of the tactics for employing tank forces began. Instead of cumbersome mechanized corps, more compact and maneuverable tank brigades were created. The system of training tank crews also changed. More attention was paid to practical skills and working out interaction with other branches of service. The experience of the first tank battles was thoroughly studied and taken into account when creating new combat regulations. Special attention was paid to the organization of logistical support and communications. Tank units received more reliable radio stations, and interaction with artillery and aviation improved. Industry took combat experience into account when modernizing existing and developing new tanks. Changes were made to the design of the T-34 and KV, increasing their reliability and combat effectiveness. Later, new models appeared. The T-34-85, IS-2, which took into account all the lessons of the first battles. By the time of the great tank battles of '43 near Kursk, Prokhorovka, Soviet tank forces had become a completely different power, retaining the best of the pre-war legacy and discarding everything that did not stand the test of battle. The battle near Dubno-Lutsk-Rovno, this first tank pogrom, became a bitter but necessary school that Soviet tank crews had to go through on their way to future victories. The Battle of Dubno-Lutsk-Rovno became a watershed in the history of Soviet armored forces. It was not just a military setback. It was a true tank rout that changed the course of the war on the southern flank of the Soviet-German front. 5 mechanized corps, numbering almost 3,000 tanks on paper, turned into scattered groups without fuel, ammunition, and command after a week of fighting. For the Red Army, this was a shock, but at the same time an invaluable, though blood-bought lesson. The historical significance of this battle is hard to overstate. For the first time in the history of warfare, such masses of armored vehicles clashed. In terms of scale, it was the largest tank battle of the initial period of World War II, eclipsing even the famous tank battles in North Africa. It clearly demonstrated that quantitative superiority without proper organization, command, and support does not guarantee victory. The defeat at Dubno forced the Soviet command to radically reconsider the tactics of employing tank troops. By the autumn of '41, the reorganization of armored forces began. The unwieldy mechanized corps, which proved ineffective in real combat conditions, gave way to more compact tank brigades. These formations were easier to command, required fewer resources for supply, and could operate independently in separate directions. The system of training tank crews changed fundamentally. If before the war, the main attention was paid to theoretical studies and parade formations, now the priority was practical training in conditions as close to combat as possible. Crews learned to operate in complex environments, with limited visibility, detached from the main forces. Special attention was paid to organizing the interaction of tanks with other branches of troops. Bitter experience showed that tanks operating without the support of infantry, artillery, and aviation become easy prey for the enemy. The new combat regulations detailed the order of joint actions, mutual recognition signals, and target designation methods. The Battle of Dubno became a powerful impetus for the development of Soviet military industry. Designers carefully studied reports from the front, analyzed the causes of tank failures, and sought ways to increase their reliability and combat effectiveness. Hundreds of changes were made to the design of the T-34 and KV, significantly improving their characteristics. The experience of the first tank battles was taken into account when creating new combat vehicles. Thus appeared the legendary T-34-85 with a more powerful gun, heavy IS-2 tanks capable of fighting any German equipment, and self-propelled artillery units of various classes. Paradoxically, it was precisely the catastrophe at Dubno that laid the foundation for the future victories of Soviet tank troops. By the time of the great tank battles of '43, at Kursk, Prokhorovka, the Red Army already had completely different tank formations. Well-trained, competently organized, skillfully interacting with aviation and artillery. The tank battle of Dubno-Lutsk-Rovno became a kind of starting point in the evolution of Soviet military art. From blind copying of pre-war theories to real combat experience, from cumbersome, unwieldy structures to flexible and effective combat organisms, from stereotypical thinking to the creative application of the principles of military art.